All right, well, welcome everybody. Gee, that's loud. Just push it back a bit. Welcome everybody to this hearing number 13 on natural character. Just to introduce the panel first of all, we've got Yvette Couch-Lewis on my right. We've got Andrew Lewis on my left. We've also got Councillor Malcolm Lyle, who's a member of the panel but can't attend today. He's read the material and he's going to view the tape session and then join us in deliberations afterwards. And I'm Gary Ray, I'm the chair of the panel. We've also got assisting us Justine Ashley, sitting in the back of the room, who's a senior planner. She's assisting the panel. We've got Emma Robertson, who's helping us with the schedule and live streaming. And we've got the reporting officer team over here, which is Mark Geddes, who's prepared the Section 42A report, and Paul Smith, who's a landscape expert, has provided a technical report as well. In terms of today, we have a tentative schedule of speakers, and we've got three presentations in the morning session. We'll shortly go to those. We've also got tabled statements from Jane West and Transpower, which the panel will consider in due course. And we have read the 42A report, Mr. Smith's report, the tabled statements, submissions, and also importantly, the document called Officer's Response to Questions from the Panel. That's a standard thing that the panels do. We ask questions ahead of the hearing to sort of give a clue as to the things that we're interested in particular, and the officers have responded. That's posted on the website, and for anyone who is watching this live stream who is yet to present to us, if you do get a chance to look at that, it might be of some use, because the officer is recommending some I suppose reasonably minor changes to some of the recommendations, but they may be of interest to submitters, including Hortense Z, who are due to appear later. And just to complete that picture, we will ask for a reply report at the end of the hearing. We'll direct the officers to focus on any particular matters that come up during the hearing, and the officers are at liberty to respond to other matters as well. So that's the process, just to put everybody into the picture. I think that's it really, other than we're still subject to the sort of COVID restrictions, and I think it's become a little looser over time, but the general principle is we wear masks where we can, but when we're speaking, it's inconvenient to do that, and we keep our separations as much as possible. I think in terms of any emergencies that might occur, we just go out through the main doors here and out into the car park at the rear of the building, and the toilets and everything are just out through those doors as well. I think that's probably a fairly good run through what we need to cover. We'll go to the presentation shortly. We do have some people joining by Zoom today as well, but thank you. And if there's no other matters to raise at this point, we'll proceed. Thank you. And first of all, we have Ellesmere Sustainable Agriculture Incorporated, Ms. Barnett. We've met you before, Ms. Barnett. Thank you for coming along, and I'd just like to thank you for the effort you've put into preparing a very thorough and comprehensive statement. And we're in your hands. We do have some questions, but you can present that to us now. Thank you.
Thank you. Also, Emma has emailed to you in the last few minutes an electronic version of what I will read here. So there may be bits within that are easier for you just to look at as I summarise some of it, in particular Table 1, when we get to that.
That's right. Thank you for doing that.
Tēnā koutou katoa, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. The first three paragraphs of my introductory spoken statement are provided for you, and I won't read those. You've heard those before. So since lodging the statement, ESAI has sought advice regarding restrictions on horticultural plantings from Johanna Blakely. She's the landscape architect who is employed by ESAI to undertake and design the landscaping and plantings associated with the Tanaku project, which, as you know, is a large-scale riparian project that we're doing in the Ellesmere area. Johanna has a Master of Arts and a Bachelor with honours in Landscape Architecture from Lincoln University, and she's also a member of NZILA. She has recent and detailed knowledge in the landscapes of many of the lowland streams in our area, and she's made the following comments. And I'll just read those for you with respect to horticultural plantings and waterways. Natural character is accentuated when land use practices follow natural landforms at setbacks appropriate to scale. By working with the landscape and existing topography, these land use practices highlight the form of local waterways and other natural features. An unintended effect of having 10 to 20 metre setback requirements from waterways for horticultural practices could be that landowners respond to these regulations by implementing straight line boundaries that do not reflect the localised topography or natural character of the area. Rather than being integrated into the landscape and complemented by surrounding land use practices, these natural features become separated by rigid land use boundaries. In many situations, wide buffers from horticultural practices will not result in a more natural ecology, but will rather become infested with exotic weeds and pest species. So this is essentially further highlights the inappropriate need, in our view, to restrict horticultural activities near surface water bodies. I've also read the officer's response to questions from the hearings panel, and I'll just make some reference to those now. Paragraph 9.2 of the section 42A reporting officer part. ESI wishes to remind the hearing panel that it has requested removal of the Ngā Turanga Tupuna overlay and recognises that all waterways within the ESI membership area are covered by the Ngā Wai overlay, including Te Waihora Lake Ellesmere. There is the possibility that some surface water bodies outside of this area and in the upper catchment of the district have not been labelled as Ngā Wai. However, it appears that all lowland waters in the district have been proved with the Ngā Wai specification. A slightly awkward situation exists within the proposed plan where the consideration of natural character is specified in certain matters for control and discretion. In particular, I've listed the one there, yet relevant rules and requirements for Ngā Wai are located in the natural character chapter. This is further complicated by the potential for activities that may not meet the natural character setback requirements for non-Ngā Wai streams, still having to be considered under the SASM Matter 3. So my suggestion here is further amendment could be made to clarify that where reference is made to that SASM Matter 3 in the natural character chapter, this should only apply to those surface water bodies that in fact have a Ngā Wai overlay applying to them. This could be achieved as a matter of a plan clarification rather than having to seek a scope in a submission. Paragraphs 10.43, 15.5 and 15.14. The reference here by ESI could relate to artificial or natural or a combination of both surface water bodies in an urban and commercial context. However, predominantly it would be artificial or modified water systems that would exist in those areas. It would be more appropriate to exclude water bodies in these contexts altogether, requiring a 30 metre setback here in a highly developed and already significantly compromised natural character setting would result in impractical and unnecessary consenting requirements. In these areas, any adverse natural character effects should have previously been addressed during the plan change or plan review process. Consequently, we would support the amendment of the definition of surface water bodies as suggested in Hort NZ submission 077. Ideally, natural character requirement 2 should specify exactly which zones it referred to, thus excluding zones such as residential, industrial and commercial. ESI does not support the proposed amended wording by the Section 42 reporting officer as suggested in that paragraph. I should just clarify here, we haven't requested that in our submission originally because we were just focused on the rural sector because that's our ambit. But in looking at it and from a general planning perspective, we've made those comments as well. Paragraph 10.60. The proposed setbacks from surface water bodies are significant, and as mentioned in our statement, will impinge substantially on existing and future land uses, the cost of which will be major for horticultural activities and any other activities that might have to be set back further if shelter was required to protect crops, for example. We do have a whiteboard here, so if there's anything you want me to draw and explain a little better and doesn't make sense, I'm more than happy to draw some figures for you. As an example of the cost associated with such setbacks, I've just given a table here from an example from a farm that's both sides of the Irwell River, and it actually contains quite a lot of that river within its property boundaries. And this is based on a 20-metre setback. So I've just set those out there. The initial top cost is the value of that land presently. It's a rough estimation based on a $60,000 per hectare price of land, which is the going rate at the moment. And that's a value that essentially you're, in inverted commas, giving away to natural character if you were to have the setback. And then we've added in what I would call a very modest value of $10,000 per hectare of income you might expect to get from a horticultural or other crop there. The rest of the calculations relate to, in all practicality, if you were going to have setbacks, you would somehow need to manage them. And the most recent way to manage them is to do some riparian restoration work in that area. It can be planted, it can be managed, and then essentially it does do well to look after itself after that. And again, those costings are based reasonably modestly. I know a small section that's been done opposite the Lakeside Hall, it's only a few, it's not even, it might be 200 metres long, a narrow sort of 5-metre width in places cost around $30,000 for 3 years. And that's not including the value of the land associated with that. So it is relatively expensive. As you can see, the cost is major and effectively results in a retirement of valuable productive land. If land areas become void near waterways, then they are difficult to manage and must have an appropriate land management treatment. I've already summarised what I've said there. In the scheme of things, it's mine and ESI's view that 10 to 20 metre setbacks are highly significant, not only in their distance, but what that actually results in farm income, etc. Even at a 10-metre setback distance, and with the estimates provided above half, the cost is still dramatic and probably quite unsustainable for some farm operations, depending on their scale. ESI strongly retains that view that horticultural plantings should in the least be excluded from the natural character requirement 3, particularly in the plains setting. I'll come to that in my next part. In response to Mr. Smith's comments, I agree that the chapter could have significantly benefited from the application of a succinct natural character study to inform its drafting. I also agree that the Selwyn portion of the Canterbury Plains, with its patchwork of agricultural activities, would be able to absorb any perceived adverse effects of horticultural plantings on natural character in respect to surface water bodies. ESI would be supportive of a provision that removes setback requirements from waterways for horticultural plantings in the plains area of the district, and that relates to those special areas RD 1 to 3. I am not convinced, however, though, that rivers will continue to narrow as intensive land use activities continue. With the multitude of regulations currently in place and with more to be implemented, I would be surprised if this was the outcome. There are now extremely stringent rules, regulations and standards in place to ensure land use systems no longer impinge on waterways. This is coupled with the many non-regulatory waterway enhancement projects that are taking place across the district. These are extending the effective widening of waterway features and in many cases being undertaken voluntarily. Ngā mihi and thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you for that. We probably going to spend a little longer with you than
Yes.
when you get set down, and I've used up some time at the start. But just on the statement you've given now, we'll ask some questions, and then other questions of your evidence in chief. But just to get things moving, with the very first part, you've referred to Johanna Blakely has provided some advice. We won't be able to treat that as expert evidence, of course, because we haven't got a statement, and we can't ask her any questions. But is it your case that she's basically supporting the evidence that you've provided in terms of the relief you're seeking? So that's how we'll take that. Thank you. And I'll just see if my fellow commissioners have any questions of this statement. First of all, Yvette, do you have any questions at this point?
Morena, and tēnā koe. Look, I'm going to concentrate on the natural character and ask you to describe for me in that Lake Ellesmere area. I just want to get a good understanding of where you're coming from. So describe to me what the natural character, in particular the drain systems that we have that are across the farm areas, and what they would look like, and the contributing factors that they have in terms of the natural character of the landscape around Waihora, around the Ellesmere catchment.
Okay. It is a tricky situation where you've got waterways that are both got natural aspects to them, and that can be in terms of their ecology, their natural fauna and fauna that live within them and their near area, but also from a visual context as well. So in terms of the naturalness of that area, it has been significantly developed by land use activities over time, and we have no argument over the change that has occurred. And in terms of the naturalness or how far that might extend from a waterway, it varies significantly across the Ellesmere area as it does as you go up the plains as well. So in the Ellesmere area, it's at a much lower level area, if you like. It's less visible in some aspects than it is in elevated areas like you might get in high country settings, etc. So in terms of the naturalness, you've got the water flowing aspect, you've got the near confines of the stream that for drainage systems have been quite modified in conjunction with the adjacent land uses. So you can expect, say, for example, Birdlings Brook is a classified drain. So it requires the council to clean and modify that waterway from time to time just to ensure that there is drainage from Leeston Township. So it's what I'd call a working stream or a working drain system, but we have tried where we can along that waterway to do some riparian works there, so that at the same time that it's operating as a drainage system on the one side, the stream will be able to be cleaned, or several access points where that can happen. But in those other areas where we're certain that there has been less pressure on to do that drainage work, there's been planting done along those areas. Now, whether it's arguable whether riparian planting, because it's been instigated by humans, if you like, later, is actually a natural aspect because it's been human induced, basically. I don't know whether I'm answering your question as detailed as you would like, but it's very variable across the district, and that's where our concern is, that if you're doing provisions around natural character, it would have really benefited from a study that looked at these particular areas to get some sort of individual feel around, okay, well, is this area high in natural character, or is it not, given that it's quite possibly going to be modified for drainage works and has been modified over time in comparison to a waterway that is in a high country setting where it's both highly visual and quite possibly never modified for drainage clearance works.
Thank you for that. And just then going into the earthworks provisions, then the need to be able to have stockpiles. Some stockpiles need to be, you're saying in your evidence, need to be close to the waterway as opposed to taking it through to the 20-metre margin. Two questions relating within there that you might be able to put together, and that is, why is it so important to retain the stockpile so close to? And secondly, what would the damage be from carting, taking your stockpile through a setback area and disturbing what is known as the natural character?
I think I might use the whiteboard.
Sure.
Yeah, yeah, sure. I'm not sure if this will be captured, but that's okay. That's pretty good.
So, broadly speaking, here's our natural waterway, here's our drain. So when you're doing drain clearance work, you're essentially pulling out weed, etc., in here onto this area. So here's your bank, here's your paddock. That may or may not be fenced. This is a fence. Then your stockpile, this is normal practice for council drainage work, it would simply be lifted into here. If you were going to have, within the setback only comes into question when you reach this area here. Because you've got your setback from the natural waterway, but not the artificial one. So once you get into here, the rule starts to apply, and that if you're doing a clearance here, which you would need to do, you're then being asked to, well, you're going to have to drag it either this way, or you're going to have to pull it 20 metres back from this area here. So if you've got a situation where you have got some spare void areas here in your paddock, and you've got your horticultural practice, or it could be any land use here coming closer, you're going to have to pull that away out into here. So if you have got some natural character values in here, this dragging is going to start impinging on that area there. That was what I was getting at, if it makes sense.
So do you think you'd be meeting the requirements of the provisions if you were dragging through the, in your honest opinion, would you think that you would be meeting that assessment that would be made in terms of the criteria?
No, I think there's two situations. You'd be doing adverse effects to your farming system, but you would also be quite possibly doing adverse effects in here in relation to your natural character. Whereas if you were allowed in this particular junction to keep the stockpile in here, as you have done down here, that in our view that would be doing less damage both agriculturally and natural character wise.
Okay. So can you also give me your opinion in terms of the drain systems that you have predominantly across the Ellesmere area? you would consider them as being part of the natural character that is known as within the Ellesmere catchment.
So just for clarification, are you meaning the drains that are strictly drains as opposed to surface water bodies? Or are we talking about the surface water bodies that are also classified drains?
I'm trying to capture that circle.
Okay. Right. Oh, I might need the question again. Sorry. Could you repeat the
Sorry.
question?
Sorry, no.
That's right. We'll come
No,
to
I
that
think
one.
you had a question around the natural character of the drainage system. So the actual drains themselves are highly modified. So my expectation here is that you've got very low natural character values in this particular area. And the waters, excuse the pun, might get a little muddy here because you've got this juncture. But you've also got the situation where you've got streams that are classified drains. So then there is quite a level of modification I would expect associated with those. And the one I'm most familiar with is Birdlings Brook. And I do know that one side in particular, for quite some stretch, it might be 3 or 4 k's, is regularly cleaned because Leaston won't drain without it. And who knows what our water systems will do in the future. We've submitted recently on plan change in Leaston, arguing that we're quite concerned about elevated water flows in this area because we don't want one side of the waterway system being flooded any more than needs to be by running from Leaston, because we've done riparian management planting and we don't want that destroyed on that particular side. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword, but my expectation is that where you've got streams that are classified as drains as well, you must expect that there is going to be a reduced level of natural character values in that area.
Kia ora, thank you. We'll leave drains for a minute. Can I just also ask you in terms of because would you consider that you know the Waihora catchment quite well in terms of the lake and the farm areas that surround the Waihora? Would you consider that you are quite knowledgeable within that area?
It's my personal background. Yes, I grew up in Ladbrokes and I did studies on the lake at university when I went to Canterbury and did my degree. So I had quite a knowledge from then. I lived on the banks of the Horsell River, so I'm quite familiar with those systems. I've lived the rest of my married life in Lakeside on the banks of Harts Creek and Birdlings Brook. And I guess, and through living and learning with people in that area, my knowledge is more agriculturally based. I'd have to admit my cultural understandings are less because we're still learning all that stuff in our area.
Kia ora, because I'd like to go to the build structures now. Yep. Well, if you'd like to draw the lake catchment in terms of the farming, because I'm looking at that buffer zone, not buffer, the setback areas. And in terms of now with these new provisions that are coming in, I'd like your opinion in terms of how the farms have been captured by those setbacks, because you're within your evidence. You have said that the buildings that are man-made, that are man-structured, that are not in line with the natural character, however, they would be captured within the setback areas around the lake. Yep.
Okay, so if we just So we've got a lake edge. And the thing to remember, I guess, is that Lake Ellesmere is not an edge like that.
No.
It's very varied and it changes a lot over time. So that's one aspect. It's difficult to know where the edge actually is from time to time and how you might measure that. So I took an aerial shot of, a look basically on Google Earth of how many houses would be within that 100-metre setback. So there are a few. It's not a huge number around the lake, but there are a few. And my experience has been that in those areas, because of your density requirements and subdivision requirements, it's unlikely to change in that area without a plan change development scenario, which would take into account natural character values at that time. So essentially, what I was looking at was that if you've got a house in this area, basically the rules then will you, I think there's been a suggestion that you might be able to make a 10-metre square addition. So it's relatively small. And my suggestion is that we extend that to something that's reasonably modest, still in a New Zealand setting, is that that's 100 metres square as a opportunity for people to still be able to extend their dwelling. They're reasonably modest dwellings around those areas, just houses generally. So then we've suggested a 30-metre setback, but perhaps it needs to be more specific in the Lake Ellesmere setting, and that if there's the opportunity to distinguish that differently from other lakes in the area, then we'd certainly be open to that.
Okay. That then brings me to the measurement that you mentioned in terms of, yes, it can be quite variable, that lake, that line, that squiggle you have made can be quite variable and dependent on climate change as well. So you've said that to define a specific landscape area for that management, and if we're not really talking about landscape, but you're talking about something specific because it's hard to define where the bank actually is to be able to define how far back you can measure that building from the lake itself, the margins of the lake. Have you put some thought into that? Has your community put some thought into that and knowing that lake line so well and how variable it is?
Yes, and in some ways I think perhaps probably a more practical situation might be a measurement from the commissioners are thinking that they would retain the Ngāwai overlay on Lake Ellesmere. It might be better to measure it from that boundary of the Ngāwai overlay. In that instance.
So just going to the Ngāwai boundary and going to the significant areas that are to Māori, the MAT1, have a seat. Can you just elaborate for me? And I was appreciate your evidence too back then on that matter. The advantage of actually having it moved over into the significant area when that chapter is more focused really around the reserves and as opposed to that wider community. What are the benefits? Yeah, go again.
I might go again. So,
Yep.
My artwork's not crazy. I think so. The Ngāwai and the other overlay, which might be outstanding natural landscape, follow a very similar line. So it's quite clear when you look on the aerial photographs where that line's been drawn. So it generally takes in those wetted areas of the margins of the lake, so it's a bit more of a rigid outline than our wide boundary. And then you've got that variable area of the lake here. So I'm reasonably comfortable with that Nawai location around Lake Ellesmere. So then what you'd be saying if you were going to have a measurement that was going to be from that edge, then it would be measured from here as to setback areas for natural character retention in here. So I don't think this Nawai area needs to be extended.
No.
Because I think that's probably right when you look at the overlays with that. But you could then use that as your measurement distance, ideally there.
So just for clarification again, there is a variable component that needs to be taken into consideration within this catchment in terms of working out the setbacks, the delineation of those setbacks.
I think, well, it depends how you treat it. Either you do a further variation and you incorporate a study on natural character values, or you use submissions to address it and you look at, well, what can we do with what we've got? So in this case, I'm suggesting it'd probably be okay around the lake to provide this sort of treatment. I'm not so convinced when you start talking around the specific other contributing waterways.
Kia ora, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Because of time, we'll ask you questions on anything basically from now on. But just before I hand over to Commissioner Willis, in terms of what you presented to us today, you presented a table with costs for, and you said in your footnote it's for a typical family farm. All of those values we'll need to know what size that farm is to be able to give that some credence, I guess, won't we? Because you've assumed a 10.6 hectare loss of, a setback. Is that along the whole banks of the Irwell River, or is that just for one typical farm?
That's just the one.
How big? What have you assumed? What is your assumptions? Yeah, it's just you've given a very specific figure of $948,280. So we'd need to know what size farm it is, whether it's 10 hectares, 100 hectares, whatever.
Well, that
Yeah.
farm would
Yeah.
probably be in the vicinity of around 300.
Oh, so it's a large farm. All right, no, that's fine. And just final question on that. That's assuming that that the farmer cannot use that setback at all. But you'll appreciate that the rules as they stand would require resource consent for possibly a restricted discretionary activity. So it's not proposing a ban on using that area, is it? It just requires a consent. That's the point you're making, though, in later evidence that it causes hardship and financial issues that are associated with getting a consent, isn't it? Yeah.
Farmers are already enough protections in place through their farm environment plan that having to go through further consenting issues with respect to this doesn't really achieve anything. Yeah.
All right, understand that. Look, I'll just hand over to Commissioner Willis, who will ask you questions on anything in your evidence, and then I'll see if there's anything else we need to ask you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your statement. And thank you also for the photographs. They were very helpful. Appreciate those. I do have a few questions, and but they're all pegged against your main statement rather than the one you provide today. I'll just scroll down, find them. Yeah, and I think it also relates to the diagram you drew earlier. So paragraph 4.8, you're talking about works at juncture locations as well. Without clearing this in this location, upgrading drain clearance where it becomes redundant, giving rise to floodwaters. And I was just interested as how frequently does that occur?
Floodwaters.
Yeah, that needing to do these works at the juncture and clearance in this location. Is that sort of like a weekly or monthly or yearly or 5-yearly basis?
I'm just reporting with respect to our property that would have those scenarios. So generally you're talking about a 3-year turnaround, and you would do those works in when the drain is dry. So the majority of the time drains are dry.
Yeah.
So they would only flow with quite heavy rainfall, and where we are, it would be slightly different in other areas, but generally people try not to excavate their drains very often at all.
Yep.
So a sort of a 3-year cycle is normal.
Okay, thank you. You've covered that question already. Yeah, it's just that relationship, I guess, with the farm environment plans and what they cover and what they don't cover. And having a look at those plans, to me, they appear to be more focused around water quality, so leaching and also sedimentation, rather than specifically natural character. And I looked at them, it doesn't state anything about natural character that's a relevant consideration. Do you have a comment on that? I mean, I think you've talked about farm environment plans as being a method and that they are sufficient, but do you have a comment on whether or not they cover natural character?
They don't specifically refer to that, I would agree there, but the components of ecology, mahangakai, cultural and biodiversity effects are definitely covered in your farm environment plan, and they're probably one of the most common things the auditor will look at when they do their inspection of your farm to make sure that you are meeting those systems. And admittedly, the implementation of an FEP is much around nutrient management with respect to the rules that require them, but they are quite extensive beyond that in terms of what components then relate to water quality, which does bring in those landscape ecology, mahangakai, cultural and biodiversity effects.
And so when I looked them up as well, I mean, I think I may have this incorrect, you can correct me. The riparian area is really, I think it was within 5 meters of the bed or bank.
Yeah.
And so that's a much more narrow focus, isn't it, than what we're talking about here? So what happens in the space between?
Yes, and that's the tricky scenario, and that's where we're coming from, is that we consider that the 5 metre distance, while specified in the regional plan, is related to the aspects that it controls, and that there are these other aspects that the district council is kind of trying to control, which have a further setback. In reality, the 5 metre setbacks of the regional plan don't eventuate as that, because the topography of the land pretty much determines what you do on those waterways. So in some areas your setback may be 10 metres, but in other areas it'll be slightly closer to that 5 metre setback, just because of the nature of the land, the steepness of the slope, how the water flows in that area. There may be less water or more water. It's quite variable, and that's where, you know, the benefit of a natural character study would have looked perhaps more closely at which particular streams or which parts of them are of high importance.
So you said it's variable depending on topography. So just as a follow-up, in an area that's flat,
yeah,
what is that situation versus an area of hill country in terms of that distance?
Quite different scenarios. So we have got a lowland stream, say. Let's try elevation here of it. So in the context of lowland streams, you say this is the bed of the waterway, you've got your stream flow here. In some scenarios, you'll have a bank low. And other areas which may be very close to where this is, the scenario will be we actually go quite a steep bank like that. So you'll have a setback in this little area relating to this bit, which might be 10 or so metres. But in this area where slope characteristics are saying, well, the runoff here there's no runoff that's going to be of significance here, you might be closer with your planting. So then you end up with a riparian management area that from here's your water, it might be like this, where it's going close here and it's coming further out. So, and it's meandering like that. So there's not really a specific measurement that you might apply. And you also have other contributing factors like, I don't know, it tends to be a common belief that all water on all paddocks runs in a sheet into a waterway across the entire paddock. Well, that doesn't happen in reality. There will be some paddocks won't have any at all. They won't have runoff directly into those waterways, but there'll be others that have a slight low point that might be in here that's not relative to any drain, etc. here. And so in these areas, through your farm environment plan audit, generally what you'd have to treat before you're next audited is some sort of riparian management work in here.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for clarifying that. And so you've said in your evidence paragraph 4.19 that the size of the extension, I think you drew that on the whiteboard as well. So 100 metres more than 10 metres. And you said more accommodating the current climate. So does that mean that's generally the size of extensions people are building when you say current climate? Is that what you mean by that phrase?
Yeah, I think, if most people, if they're going to do an extension to their house, if they're going to put a lot of money forward for that sort of work, they're generally only going to do it once. So they'll do something that's more sizable than something that's very small, but just because of the costs of building at the moment.
Right. Thank you. Just want to clarify that. I think I've got one more question. Yeah. You commented on existing use rights. Just thinking, where is that?
I think it's in several places.
Yeah, and the difficulty of applying that. And so in your proposed amendments, which is in 4.33 to under requirement 3, REQ 3, so it's on page 13. And the growers you've proposed that are not the replacement in the same location of the existing woodlot and shelter planting. So I guess I'm just querying, if it's challenging to confirm existing use rights, how do you confirm whether something is a replacement in the same location in a standard?
I think that's where I've come to this similar conclusion as perhaps what you're thinking in 4.33, where I've said in lieu of removing R3 and requirement 3 altogether, this is the space you would come to. And I quite agree that the proposal there to amend that in terms of existing woodlot, etc., the offer there is that it offers slightly more comfort than, say, just relying on existing use rights alone, but it's both fraught.
Sure. No, thank you. No further questions.
Thanks for that. I just had a question about, well, I have several questions, but in terms of your paragraph 4.5, I just wondered, you've talked to some of the other submitters, Hort NZ and Ms. West. Have you prepared some sort of, I guess the answer is no, but have you considered preparing some sort of joint statement as to what would satisfy all three parties? Have you got to that point or not?
No, we haven't.
No, okay. But would it be fair to say that you have similar concerns and similar suggestions?
Yes.
But not necessarily exactly the same. Okay. All right, thanks for that. In terms of paragraph 4.8, you talk about drainage clearance activities, and there's some discussion about whether clearance of drains is caught by the earthworks rule, REQ1 and R1. Can you just for my edification, what does drainage clearance entail? Does it involve, what does it actually involve? How do you clear drains?
So
Diggers and so forth?
generally, you would have a contractor come with they use a digger, but the actual apparatus they use is not a straight bucket. It has a filtering effect, if you like. So when it goes in, it's aimed at bringing up the weed, and it will bring with it a certain amount of sediment associated with that weed that it brings with it. So there will be an amount of sediment that comes up with it, usually silt.
So what happens to the material that's scraped out of the drains? Is it stockpiled or taken away?
So that will sit there, and it sits as a mound along the waterway, and over time there will be, it allows for any, it's usually done in dry periods, so that if there's any life within there, they have the ability to get back into that area that it's been in, so they can travel there. Otherwise it will just sit there, and over time the farmer may be able to take that and just model it around the boundary of the drain, basically.
Right. And in terms of some of your evidence, I haven't got the exact paragraph here, but you talk about that a lot of the drains have been cleared anyway in the artificial watercourses, and that's being done by contractors, etc. Is it your understanding that they have a consent to do that, or a global consent, or they just aren't required to have a consent?
In terms of the council drains, my understanding is that they will have a global consent for some of it, but I can't guarantee without looking at them whether they have it for all of it. And then in terms of straight farm drains, they aren't required to have a specific consent.
Right. All right, thanks for that. And I was just going to ask you about the suggestion for a 30-metre setback. There's been some discussion today as well, but was there any sort of science behind that, or how did you come to the 30 metres in preference to the 100?
It was a judgment call, basically, to determine something that was, a little bit more flexible, that it offered a bit more attenuation than the 20-metre setback that had been proposed. So that's how that came to be.
Okay. I think that I've made a number of notes throughout your evidence, which I'd like the officers to respond to. So I haven't got direct questions for you, because I think I understand what you're saying, but I will put those to the officers at the end of the hearing to ask them to respond in their reply report. But I'll just quickly see if there's anything. I suppose I had a question that I might put to several of the presenters, and that's the theme of duplication of rules, and you've come to us on the SAMS hearing, and you'll possibly come to us on some of the other hearings too. But I was just interested in your view as to, would you accept that where there's a chapter in the plan that has a focus on, say, natural character, and then another one on landscape and Maori values and so forth, is it unfair to have a situation where you might need more than one consent if a property happens to be, or a setback area happens to affect some of those principles in each of those chapters? Is it your expectation that there would only ever be a single consent required? Is that where you're coming from?
I think that's preferential from being on the other side of the coin, I guess. But yeah, it really depends on what scenarios you're talking about, because it does vary quite a bit, where there's might be 2 overlays relating to one area, and in another situation there may be 4 or more. Yeah.
So if a farmer engaged a planning consultant, for instance, to obtain a resource consent for a rule that's triggered in this chapter. And it turned out that there was also another rule that was triggered in another chapter. I'm just curious as to how onerous it would be for that consultant to then do another sub-assessment within the overall consent for another value that's triggered, I guess. I can understand the point from a layman's point of view that it seems confusing and bureaucratic potentially, but for preparing an application, is it really onerous to do another assessment within the body of that application for a setback?
It could be if you're looking at having expertise, you're having to go to several consultants, just not your planning one. So you're having to pay for the cost of those extra assessments to be done. Yes.
All right. I think you've answered that well. Thank you very much. No further questions. Are there any points of clarification from the officers at this point as to, we will be asking you to respond to some of these matters. Is there anything you'd like me to ask the witness to help you understand where they're coming from? Not from you? Okay, thank you. Mr. Smith? Very good. Very good. Yeah, thanks for the effort you've gone to. As always, you've done a very thorough job. Thank you. Okay.
Thanks.
All right. Right, we'll now move to the next presentation, please, which is Federated Farmers, Dr. Hume. Yep, please come forward. Right, welcome, Dr. Hume. Thank you for preparing the statement again, and you can present that to us however you wish. Do you have a sort of summary to give of your statement? Okay. Fairly brief. Yep, that's all right. Yes, that's right. And we'll just see if there's any specific questions about that. I'll throw it over to Andrew this time.
No specific questions from me, thank you.
Okay. Yvette?
Just interested in some clarification around the wording, if you like. I just want to drill down a little bit more. So in terms of your paragraphs 12 through to 14, there is a questioning around Māori perspectives within there. Or if not, can you just clarify for me, the perception of who within here, and what is meant by the intent of, like, within paragraph 13? What is it that I didn't quite understand? Oh, sorry, got it. I'll just quickly ask that again. I'm looking at paragraphs 12 to 14. I'm just wanting some clarification in terms of the perception that is within there of whom and what the intent that you were hoping to get by making the statements. In terms of, I'll give you an example. You're looking a bit lost at me.
Thank you.
So I'll give you an example. There appears to be a need for greater clarity and transparency about how the natural character must be assessed and what part Māori perceptives and expertise and tradition should play in this process. And I just want you to tease that out a bit more. What is it that you're trying to get at there?
I guess that reflects a lack of clarity in my own mind, really, about what is required when one assesses natural character. Obviously, Māori perspectives are a part of that. What part of that? How can anyone that wants to look after natural character kind of get a handle on that, I guess? I guess it wasn't clear to me, which is probably why I wrote that. But I'd imagine that's not clear to some others.
Where do you hope to get that clarity from? Because I'm not quite sure myself either, in terms of how it's worded there.
Well, I
And
guess
it's not my role to help.
I guess the
You need
council
to
notifies a
tell me.
plan, so council has to come up with characteristics and thresholds around particular things, in this case to do with natural character in the vicinity of water bodies.
So the objective that we have in objective 2, in terms of looking at the provisions, would that be a place of clarity, that there is the need that within looking at the setbacks for the farms and working within the space, would objective 1 give some clarity there for your members to be able to work with Ngāi Tahu to be able to meet those values and the interests that they have within the water bodies? Or is that still not clear enough, objective, looking at that objective?
Yeah, I guess that implies more of a process rather than a bunch of characteristics or thresholds that have to be met. And in terms of the my statement in paragraph 13 that the concept of natural care, that a whole bunch of these things are yet to be fully addressed. I was really quoting that out of a publication that I cited, and it seemed to ring true to me. It wasn't particularly clear to me what bearing Māori values, perspectives, expertise did have. And obviously, in order to determine that, well, obviously the council has some responsibility in that area because it's notifying the plan. And obviously there's a process of consultation involved, but is there something other than that someone can refer to and say, well, if I look after all these particular things, then I've taken care of Māori perspectives regarding natural character?
I appreciate that farm environment plans put a lot of, if I may use the word, pressure on your members in terms of meeting the requirements within those plans to look at water quality. And I'm just, have you put some thought, the members, in terms of how farm management plans might play a role across in assisting with those values? Because within farm management plans, there most definitely is looking at mahinga kai and looking at all those values that are within there. Have your members put any thought towards towards the use of farm management plans within the provision framework within the district plan that could assist in this area.
Yeah. Yeah, I think they probably have. As you say, there's quite a lot of requirements within farm environment plans that do bear on this subject area. I guess to what extent do people need to go beyond that to satisfy the natural character requirements of this plan, I guess, is a question, but we would argue that quite a lot of things that are required in terms of natural character in the plan are already addressed in farm environment plans. Whether that's sufficient is open to question, I guess, but those matters certainly are addressed, and people are taking these things increasingly seriously.
Kia ora, thank you. And just one final question. In paragraph 18, farm activities, close proximity to surface bodies, surface water bodies. What are some of these in relation to essential activities? What are the essential activities that would need to be carried out in close proximity to a surface water body?
Well, the one I had in my mind first was clearing of drains, which you've already had considerable discussion about. Things like pump sheds, which is also already covered now. The matters that Horticulture New Zealand are talking about with regard to control of loss of sediment into water bodies. Those are three things that immediately come to mind. And also some matters to do with irrigation. Yeah, there's a whole lot of, well, there are some things to do with running an irrigation system where there is a requirement to get reasonably close to a water body.
Kia ora and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just a couple of questions from me, Dr. Hume. In relation to your paragraph 14, just to confirm that Federated Farmers is happy with the recommendation of the reporting officer to reject your submission on P1.1, and that's where the discussion about the Ngāi Tahu values, and that they're in different chapters, but you're quite happy with them being retained in policy 1. Is that correct?
Well, I had a chat with one or two lawyers within our staff, and they indicated it didn't really, if the matters were to be addressed in the plan, it didn't particularly matter where so much. And to me, it's the matters that are addressed are matters that affect a whole range of areas, not just the areas highlighted in the sites and areas of significance for Māori chapter.
Thank you. And in relation to paragraph 17, I think you might have misunderstood the amendment that the officers made. I'll just explain get your take on that. I think you're.
I wondered if I might have.
Well, we'll get the officer to confirm, but the amendments to policy 1 don't show 2 and 3. But I think I don't think they're to be deleted, because if they were to be deleted, they'd be struck out. So
yeah,
we'll get a response on that. But I'm pretty sure that the officers aren't suggesting that 2 and 3 be deleted out of that policy. But I'll come back to us on that. Let's see if I had anything else. 18. Just finally, just in relation to your paragraph 30, you've made a point about Indigenous vegetation. That's REQ3. You said Federated Farmers continue to have concern about the wording of REQ3 because presumably woodlots and shelter belts could consist of Indigenous species. So you've requested that Indigenous vegetation needs to be explicitly excluded from the setback requirements. And that's something that I would ask the officers to respond to as well in due course. But maybe not at this point, but Have you had a chance to consider that paragraph 17, that the amendment to P1?
So that is
Yep.
with those two policies that are coming out. Yes.
They are coming out.
No.
Oh, they're not. Okay.
Just to-
All right.
So I was told just to be,
Yes,
just to show you provisions that are being used, so
Yeah.
those policies are staying.
That's right. So that might help you understand what's been recommended to us anyway.
Yeah.
But thank you for that. We've got no further questions. Thank you for coming along and answering those questions.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Right. We'll now go to Horticulture New Zealand, and I imagine that Lynette Wharf is on the Zoom call. Is that correct? Yep, she is. Had a chance to consider that paragraph 17, the amendment to P1. Oh, there's a bit of a delay on the. Can you hear me okay, Lynette? Can you hear me?
Oh, you just a moment.
Sounds like I'm still talking.
Sorry, I just had YouTube on as well. So
Oh, I see. There's a delay on that. Okay. Thank you for coming in. I think we've got you at about the right time. I think we've got it just over 35, 40 minutes or so to ask you some questions. Thanks for coming on, Ms. Wharf. Is there anything you'd like to, would you like to summarise your evidence, or would you be happy to go straight to questions? Whatever suits.
just a couple of comments in addition to the just to say that I support the Ellesmere Sustainable Ag statement, which isn't the same as Horticulture New Zealand's, but it's complementary, and in particular, I support their identification that some of these water bodies that are identified for natural character are in fact artificial, which doesn't quite meet the requirements of Section 6A of the Act. So, and that some of them are effectively, in Ms. Barnett's estimation, are more or less drains. So certainly support their statement on that, identifying that issue. I've read the responses to the questions that you sent out to the 42A report writer and Mr. Smith. Just on the pre-consultation, the vegetation reports that Hort New Zealand was circulated all focused on the ONLs. There was no suggestion in those original reports that natural character might be affected. And in the water report, which Hort New Zealand wasn't actually consulted on, so it's interesting, Hort New Zealand was sent a whole bundle of reports in the early consultation, but the water one wasn't one in the bundle that was sent to them, so weren't involved in that. But just looking at that, the focus is mainly on amenity planting and shelter belts, not on horticultural plantings. So just clarify that where we got to with that. The 20 metres, there's some sort of suggestion, well, 20 metres is just the width of the road, it's not a significant area. In terms of an orchard, that could be a significant area. It could be 1 or 2 rows of trees. So it's and depending on the length of stream bank that you may be affected, it could be a significant area. So, and the question about what happens to that land if it can't be planted, you've got a 20-metre area that can't be planted. Is it actually better to have it in a planting than to have it go into just weed or unmanaged because it's not permitted for planting? So there becomes a question of that. Should a consent be required? In my opinion, given the types of natural character that's evident when you look at some of the maps and the lack of justification, I don't consider that a consent should be required for horticultural plantings in particular within those natural character areas on the plain. And I think Ms. Barnett summarised it quite nicely by talking about the patchwork on the plains and along the stream banks, and horticultural plantings are part of that patchwork. But happy to take questions.
Thank you. I might just ask a couple to get the ball rolling. But just on that last point, natural character. I think it's in your evidence, and you might be able to help me. That you've got a definition at paragraph 6.9 of naturalness is defined, and I guess the discussion is, and also your paragraph 6.15. I was going to ask you a related question about. Your paragraph 16, you make the point, it is important to reflect that section 6A does not seek to limit all subdivision use and development, but rather that natural character is protected from, quote, inappropriate subdivision use and development. And I guess the related question is, in your view, is the patchwork quilt of, horticulture, including shelter belts and horticultural plantings, is that inappropriate subdivision and development in a rural context?
No, I think that land use is quite appropriate in the rural context, and and patchwork, the plantings that we're talking about, and that's why I'm concerned that it's being regarded as being inappropriate in the context of the plan. In terms of the definition of naturalness, that has come from this latest guidelines by the Institute of Landscape Architects, which is, I think I put a link in my evidence. The text, as I understand it, is finalised, but it's just going through the edit process of having graphics and various things put in, but the text as such is finalised.
And while we're on that, what do you can you expand on that definition as it stands? The extent to which natural elements, patterns, and processes occur, the extent to which an area is unmodified. How does that? I'm just interested. How does that help us? Because it doesn't explain what natural elements are, does it? Is that modified?
Well, it does. They also have a. Let me just find it. They do have the definition of natural, which I may not have put in there, but in the guidelines as well, those elements that are of natural origin, landform, vegetation, water bodies, rather than human origin, building infrastructure. Natural landscapes are those characterised more by natural than built elements. So
that's quite important. I'm just seeing if that is in your evidence, can you please let us know? And if not,
I don't think I've included that, but that's the definition of natural in the landscape architect guidelines. And
read it out one more time, please.
Those elements that of natural origin, landform, vegetation, water bodies, rather than human origin, buildings, infrastructure.
Right. So how does farming fit into that, do you think? What's your view on that?
Well, the vegetation, because vegetation is natural, rather than a human as a building.
So it's vegetation versus built form that it's focused on in your view. Okay. All right. We'll certainly invite the officers to respond to that in due course as well. Thank you. Look, I'll hand over to the other commissioners while I organise my other questions for you. But do you have any questions at this stage?
Good morning, and thank you for your evidence, which I found very interesting reading, especially the erosion plan.
Right.
I too am thinking in terms of naturalness and thinking in terms of the horticulture, vegetation, and the importance of food production. So I'm just wanting you to be able to elaborate a little bit for me, for my understanding, in terms of, and I appreciate the example you gave in the photo of the boundary, the setback, sorry, in terms of berries, of and how that the impact of that on the natural character of the environment, how that would be perceived. I'd like to hear a little bit more from you about your members and the naturalness of the vegetation, the plants, the food, and their contribution to that natural environment. Because it is a different way of thinking in terms of the natural environment. I'd like to hear from you a bit more on that, a bit more compelling.
So the horticultural systems that operate in Selwyn that and could be impacted by these rules take two forms. There's the vegetable growing operations, which there's quite extensive vegetable growing operations in the Selwyn area, which a lot of potatoes and other vegetable crops. And then there's your established orchard berry type crops, which are permanent plantings, whereas your vegetables work in a rotational system. The blackcurrant seemed to be the most dominant orchard crop within the plains in Selwyn and quite an important crop within the Selwyn district. And they, as I understand it, the blackcurrant production in Selwyn is significant in terms of the national production. So because Selwyn has got so much high-class soil or highly productive land, its use for horticulture is really important in the national context for food production. And while we're looking at this little microcosm of natural character, we must not forget that this is set in the whole context of the plan, the strategic directions of the plan, in terms of what's sought for Selwyn. And food production feature and the use of highly productive land features in those that strategic direction for Selwyn.
I don't know if you have saw the costs that we got this morning from Ellesmere Trust in relation to the setbacks and the cost of non-productive land that the setbacks might incur within the productive soil zones. Have your members had some thoughts around this? Do you have a comment in terms of that loss of productive lands?
I haven't seen that. Did Ellesmere present the data this morning?
Yes.
Oh, so I haven't seen that, so I can't comment on that. It would be quite easy for us to get an economic assessment of the value, the lost opportunity with the land, say, taken out of a blackcurrant operation, but we haven't done that. But it could be done. We have an agricultural economist who does that sort of work that could do it if you thought it was important in terms of informing your decisions.
And just one final question, in terms of the changes that have been recommended in terms of the horticultural and planting with the striking out of vegetation and the changes across there that have been recommended to us, are you happy with those changes that have been made to Rule 3? And the RGQ, I think it's 3. Yes, 3, yeah. Where we're now looking at vegetation being taken out in horticulture?
Well, not particularly because, but it doesn't, from Horticulture New Zealand's point of view, it's still vegetation plantings would still capture horticultural planting, so it's not a significant amendment. It's the principle of including horticultural planting within the within that rural framework.
Kia ora. So it is of your opinion then that this change, that this amendment that is being suggested is not changing the intent at all here?
Well, vegetation plantings isn't defined in the plan. So to the extent that it does clarify what plantings would the rule would apply to, it does clarify that, but it doesn't remove the fundamental issue that I have with the approach that the plan is taking.
Kia ora, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for your evidence. And I too found the erosion sediment control guidelines quite interesting, especially the pictures and trying to work out what was going on, what wasn't going on, and the various techniques. It's very interesting. Thank you. I do have a few questions. I'll just scroll down. So the first question I've got is looking at the farm environment plans, and so paragraph 10.2, 10.3, 10.4 of your evidence. And specifically 10.4, where you talk about the requirements of Schedule 7 of the Land and Water Plan in Section 5E.
Yes.
So, yes, I looked up Section 5E, and it talks about the management area for water bodies, and the objective is around avoiding damage to the bed and margins and to avoid direct input of nutrients and sediment. And the targets associated with that are around excluding stock, minimise nutrient sediments and microbial pathogen lost to the water bodies. There's some management around farm tracks, etc., and also in relation to sediment sources, nutrients and microbes, and then mahinga kai. But I didn't see natural character in there as such. Do you have a comment on that?
Natural character isn't in there per se, but what I was trying to say is if you are addressing all those issues, then you are likely to also be addressing natural character. Now, the elephant in the room really is the fact that the government is about to come out with new guidelines for farm environment plans at a national level imminently. What we don't know is exactly what's going to be in those new requirements for farm environment plans, and it may well be, but we're crystal ball gazing here. But what we need to recognise is that this whole process of farm environment plans is quite an evolutionary process that's underway, and I would think the requirements will become greater, not lesser. So this Canterbury Land and Water Plan is quite old in terms of setting up the framework for a farm environment plan. Things are moving on. I would suspect that natural character may well be in the new set of requirements, but you know, that, as I say, that's crystal ball gazing at this stage. But if you are addressing wetlands, riparian areas, margins of surface water bodies, and you're managing them to avoid damage to the bed and the water body and avoid those other direct inputs. If you're going to avoid damage to something, then you are going to be looking after what is actually there. So it doesn't say implicitly natural character, but you're avoiding damage to those riparian margins.
So I also looked up what a riparian margin is, and in Schedule 7 and 5E, and it refers to riparian margins, and that appears to me to be 5 metres from the bed. So only that 5 metre area for much of Selwyn, and 10 metres if I think it's in a hill or high country or a big greater distance. So I'm interested in whether earthworks or other activities greater than 5 metres could have an impact on natural character. So LWRP, riparian margin, means the land within the following distances of the bed of any lake, river, or wetland boundary: hill and high country 10 metres, and all other lands 5 metres.
Yes. And I suppose that was struck to put the balance in there about enabling the use of the land but managing that margin, as I understand it. I wasn't involved in the actual establishment of this plan, so but that's how I understand it. It was a balance between managing the margin, 5 metres in the lowland area, because Horticulture New Zealand's interest is mainly in the lowland areas, but also being able to use that land for highly productive purposes.
Sure, but the district plan's talking about other areas, isn't it? Beyond that 5 metres, where it takes
Yes.
them. So could activities beyond 5 metres have an impact on natural character, because the farm environment plan technically, or is focused on that bed to the 5 metre margin?
Potentially built structures, but in terms of the vegetation planting, I don't see that within beyond the 5 metres is detrimental to natural character, where you've got a natural planting occurring.
Okay, and stockpiling of earthworks?
That's not an issue that I'm particularly of concern about.
Okay. So just looking down my questions. Yeah, I think the last one I've got's paragraph 11.10 of your evidence, and you refer to the section 42A report recommending pump sheds and irrigation structures less than 10 metres in squared area, less than 10 metres in the area, be provided for in Schedule 3 areas. And my question is, have you looked at the officer's response to the panel's questions? Because they're proposing in addition to this restriction.
Yes, I did. I wasn't quite clear what they're suggesting, but you know, you're going to need pump sheds and Schedule 2 rivers as well, and others. Question, sorry, refer me to which question was that in the it's
10.4. Thank you.
10.4. I was not clear from what was in this response exactly that it was that they would allow pump sheds for Schedule 2 or the other water bodies. Sorry, maybe I'm reading the wrong part, but that
If I can help you with that, I asked that question, and that was really just a matter of clarification on how the rule was worded. It could be read in two different ways. It could mean that the building is 10 square metres or the extension is 10 square metres, and the officer has responded just by changing some words to make it clear it's only the extension that's allowed to be 10 metres. So I don't think that that's really a clarification issue. It's not going to any wider principles.
I think my question was more in relation to 10.43, so it's the one below that.
Oh, right. Oh, sorry.
The one below that. So.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, it's the additions to the clause A.
Well, that's the artificial lake or wetland that was created as part of a residential development. Is that what you're referring to?
Actually, I'm not sure that is a question either.
10.43.
Sorry. Just trying to find it now. Sorry, I'm actually trying to find it myself now. No, that's not it. Yeah. Oh, please. Actually, it's under. Yeah, it is 10 point. So it's above the 10. It's 10.39 to 10.40. So it's the one above, not below.
Right.
Apologies.
And what he's done there is underline something that wasn't underlined in the strike through. He hasn't actually changed the wording.
He's added in reference to within 10 metres of the bank of a surface water body as well.
Yes, but it still doesn't change the application of that to the Schedule 2 or the other rivers. He's only applied that to the Schedule 3.
I just wanted to bring that to your attention that those extra words have been added into that because you referred to it in your evidence. I just question whether you are what your comments are on the additional words.
So, being pedantic, when it says except for pump sheds and irrigation structures less than 10 square metres and travelling irrigators within 10 metres of a bank of a surface water body, does the 10 metres apply to only the travelling irrigators or to the pump sheds and irrigation structures?
I believe so.
I suppose all we need to do at this stage is ask what you would prefer, and we
Well,
can come back to it.
I'm not adverse to that, but I would want it applied to Schedule 2 and other surface water bodies.
All right, thank you for answering that. Appreciate that. Sorry to putting you on the spot, but I just wanted to bring that to your attention.
No. Well, it raises a question about clarity of intent.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for the questions.
Thank you, Ms. Wolf. Look, I appreciate time's running on, but did you have a good chance to read that response in some detail, or have you just sort of gone through it quickly? It's just that there's some
fairly quickly. I only actually managed to pick it up yesterday, so
it's fairly recent, I must admit. But I'm just wondering whether there's two ways: one for me to ask you some questions on it, or to allow you some time to read it, even during the interval, and maybe come back to you either for our next session.
Happy to take some questions and see if I feel comfortable answering them.
Okay. Well, look, I've made a note of it's 10.6 on the response to questions, 10.6. And this relates to the Section 32 report. You'll see the question.
Yes.
I think this is a question I posed, and it's in response to your evidence. The panel would be interested to see whether the 32 report did address natural character. And I've had a quick look at the reports. They're quite comprehensive. But there's a Section 32 report for water, natural character of water. And then there doesn't appear to be any other Section 32 reports relating to natural character generally in the rural zone. Did you have a chance to look at those reports and come into your evidence?
Yes, I did look at that natural character water Section 32 report, and that was the only one that I felt that's where I was concerned that there didn't seem to be the justification in that report.
Okay, now, and we understand that point, so I won't ask you any further questions on that.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. The other one was 15.5. That's where you pointed out, or your submission pointed out, that the 42A report didn't address your paragraph relating to water bodies. There's been a response to that. Have you had a chance to read that?
That's fine, and I had pointed out in my evidence that the submission on surface water body was redundant if the change was made to the definition of surface water body. Sorry, the definition to the bank of the surface water body was redundant if the change was made to the definition of surface water bodies. But I don't agree with the actual recommended change. I think there's a definition in the plan of artificial water courses, and the plan should be relying on that, not adding additional words to the actual definition.
What you just told us then is in your evidence. that right?
Yes.
That's in your evidence in chief. Okay, just I'm trying to make a note of it, but if it's in there, I'll come back to
Yeah.
it. Thank you. And finally, there was a question, a sort of broad question that we posed at the end for Paul Smith, Mr. Smith.
Yes.
And that, again, this is picking up on the theme of your evidence where it's really how much work has been done in terms of natural character versus landscape, and are the two issues fused together? Are they clearly distinct? And you've made that point quite strongly. But the response is on the next page, which is under item 2. There's a particular paragraph I'd like you to have a look at. It's the third paragraph down under 2. It's the second last page. Isn't it a
Yes.
number? And you'll recall I asked a question about what's an appropriate development. And the last sentence in that third paragraph, this is because in most situations, man-made modifications reduce the naturalness or natural character of the district's water bodies and their margins. So Mr. Smith has used the word modifications. You use the word structures or buildings as opposed to vegetation. So we'll probably ask Mr. Smith to clarify what he meant by modifications, but you've been quite clear that you distinguish buildings from vegetation. Is that still the case?
Yes, that's absolutely correct. And you may note that Horticulture New Zealand actually sought some amendments to the building structures REQ 2, I think it is, and wanted artificial crop protection structures in there. I haven't pursued that in my evidence because I made quite a distinction between the buildings and structures, which are man-made, and the horticultural plantings, which are more natural. And if I take the sentence that you just quoted, I would not regard the horticultural plantings as man-made, that because of that they are vegetation, which is a natural item.
I think, thank you very much. We understand that. So I think we've got any further questions. Thank you very much. Really appreciate
Thank
your
you.
participation. All right. Right, just for the hearing, we're running a little bit behind time. We'll take a short break now to just have a cup of tea and refresh, but we'll come back as soon as we can within about 10 minutes. So thank you very much. Thank you for being with us for the next presenters, Manawa Energy Limited. Sorry, we're running a little bit behind time, but we've certainly got enough time to have your presentation and ask you questions. So thanks for coming along. Just to ask you, there's two people on. If you just can introduce yourselves, that would be good. Thank you.
Hi, can I just check that you can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you fine. Thank you.
Perfect. My name is Shelby McFarlane Hill. I'm an environmental policy advisor with Manawa Energy. And with me today, I have Renee Calland, principal planner with Tonkin and Taylor, and she'll be presenting our expert evidence today. My evidence was the company evidence, and it can largely be taken as read. The one point that I just want to direct you commissioners towards today is obviously the change in name from Trustpower to Manawa Energy. So the generation arm of our Trustpower business has split away from the retail business, and we've essentially been stood up as our own generation company. So for the sake of our previous interactions with the Selwyn District Plan Review and the hearings and whatnot moving forward, the interest that was previously known as Trustpower will now be known as Manawa.
Yes, thank you for that. That's fine. We've got that on board. All right. Look, I'll just see if we have any questions of your initial statement. I haven't got any, but we'll just ask the other commissioners.
No, nothing from me. Thank you.
Ms. McFarlane? Ms. Farlane? No, okay. Thank you. We're ready to move to your expert witness now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, commissioners. Can I just check you can hear me all right?
Yes.
Excellent. Now, you're no doubt aware from previous presentations to the committee that Manawa consider it imperative that the MPS for renewable electricity generation is given effect to in the Selwyn District Plan, and in particular policies C and D. To that end, the plan has included a number of objectives and policies in the Energy and Infrastructure chapter, and also Rule 29 that's specific to the Lake Coleridge Hydroelectric Power Scheme. The Energy and Infrastructure chapter is being developed as a standalone chapter, and the notes to the plan uses in both the Energy and Infrastructure and the Natural Character chapters are clear that activities need not be assessed against rules in the other chapters. However, in the case that a resource consent is required under the Energy and Infrastructure rules for a discretionary or non-complying activity, the objectives and policies of other chapters may then be considered. In this instance, Objective 1 and Policy 1, as well as the Requirement 1, could potentially lead to a situation where the decision maker has to consider competing provisions and determine which to afford primacy. To avoid that situation, I've recommended some additional wording to recognise the functional need for the important infrastructure to be located on the surface and margins of water bodies. Now, with regards to Requirement 1, the reporting officer asked some questions regarding potential works and the scale of those works. The scale of the works is restricted under Rule E1 R29, which then cross references to NFL Requirement 9, and that has permitted earthworks volumes of 500 cubic metres and an area of 1,000 square metres. So in my wording that I've proposed before you, I've added a further restriction referencing works carried out in conjunction with those undertaken in accordance with a regional resource consent. On reflection, I would also like to now take this opportunity to allow for works undertaken in accordance with a permitted activity in a regional plan as well. So therefore, I propose to insert the words after the word water body, insert the words "that is permitted by a rule in a regional plan," so that it reads, those undertake, so this is in the exclusion under C in that requirement 1, those undertaken for operation and maintenance of the Coleridge hydroelectric power scheme in conjunction with works within the bed of a water body that is permitted by a rule in a regional plan, or for which a regional consent is held. And I can send this wording through to the hearings coordinator so that you've got a copy of that as well. But before I do that, I'd also like to reiterate that this wording will only be necessary if the natural features and landscape chapter doesn't cross-reference to this chapter. And of course, we haven't had that hearing or seen that officer's report yet, but I can provide an update on where we sit once we get to that chapter and can confirm.
Yes, that's fine. If you can please send in that amended wording and give it some context, the point you just made about the other hearing to come, that would be
Yes.
useful for us to have that, and that can also be forwarded to the next panel, or you may just provide that in evidence to the next hearing. Yep. But thank you for doing that.
That's all right.
Offering to do that. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and I appreciate you guys have got a big task ahead of you with looking at all the cross references and matching everything up. And so, yeah, being able to do that, we appreciate that opportunity.
So are you ready for any questions now? Or
Yes,
did
yeah.
You are. Oh, you are. Okay, thank you. All right. Any questions, Yvette? Andrew, any questions?
Yeah, I do have one. Look, thank you for your evidence. I found that very clear and concise. And thank you also for collating all those recommended changes in the appendix. It was very helpful. So really looking at paragraph 15 of your evidence, the main issue is that appears to be that, the words natural character aren't in policy 1 or policy 2 in the energy and infrastructure chapter. So it's essentially the main issue, isn't it? And I looked to see if you had scope in your submissions to amend those as an alternative solution. And I saw that Trustpower did submit on those 2 policies, but didn't seek this change. I mean, if you had scope, would that be an alternative solution?
So could you please repeat that? Which
So
are you talking
changing
back to policy, the energy policies?
Yes, as opposed to the natural character provisions. Yeah.
Yes, because we didn't. You're correct. We didn't address it there because we were those policies were such that they kind of stood by themselves, and then with the relief we'd sought here, in terms of scope, whether we could then go back and look at those, I think that so long as it's addressing the relief that we've sought here, that we would then have scope to do that if that was the Commissioner's preference to go backwards, because it's essentially seeking that same relief.
Yep, that's right. Yeah, just thinking about how it might be done. Should the commissioners agree with you? And then the other question that you've actually clarified it, which was just around the changes to REQ1 and then addition to clause C, which you've clarified that it's only if that cross reference is included. So I just wanted to clarify that, but you've already clarified it for us. So thank you.
Excellent.
Right, thank you. Just a couple of questions from me too, please. In terms of the tracked changes you've helpfully provided in Appendix A, so I'll read out 01. The natural character of surface water bodies and their margin is preserved, and the office is suggesting and enhanced where appropriate, and you're suggesting and practicable while recognising the functional need of important infrastructure to be located on the surface and margins of water bodies. I'm just interested in an observation as a planner. It would, if we were to grant that relief, that the main policy would have almost 60% of the words devoted to the functional need of the important infrastructure rather than the principal retention of natural character or preservation. It just seems a little lopsided in terms of the wording provided. Have you thought of, has that been a concern, or have you thought of a way to get around that?
I understand completely what you're saying, and yes, this is a natural character chapter, and so therefore you would want it to be concise in that respect, and it becomes a bit unwieldy towards the important infrastructure side of things. I'm not too sure how we would trim that down.
That's okay. I think I'm trying not to be critical. It's just a sort of an observation from a drafting point of view. It tends to skew it, but I think you've understood the issue there, and we'll need to give that some more thought. But the other question I had on that was, it talks about important infrastructure, but you're principally here concerned with Lake Coleridge hydropower scheme, aren't you? And this,
yes, yeah,
this would broaden it to include all important infrastructure. Yeah, but that's your principal concern, obviously.
yes, yeah, and so we've used the term important infrastructure to be consistent with the plan, but if you wanted to make it specific to Manawa's activities, whether it be renewable energy or specific to Lake Coleridge scheme, then either of those would be acceptable to Manawa.
And thank you for that. The other question I had was 25, and you've just had a question on that, adding the words in at the bottom. So an exclusion for the works undertaken for operation and maintenance of the Coleridge HEPS, etc. I see the link to being permitted or a regional consent is held. The question I was going to ask you, and I think I've got to the answer myself, where is the evidence on why those works would not have some effect? You certainly push the point quite strongly that there's a need to provide for operation and maintenance of the facility, the infrastructure. But is there any evidence on what the effect of allowing those things to be excluded from the rule might be?
Yeah.
And I think you've linked it to regional council consents and permitted activities under a regional plan. Is there anything missing in terms of natural character that might not be covered by those rules?
Yeah, I think the other thing too is the link to the earthworks restriction in the NFL chapter, and that is the 500 cubic meters in the 1,000 square meter area. So that's another further restriction to minimize adverse effects. So I think all of those coupled together means that it's not going to be a large scale activity that would have significant adverse effects.
And that's in your paragraph above, I've just noticed too. You
Yes,
referred to
yeah.
the okay, thank you. The question I had was, did you have any comment on Transpower's statement? They provided a tabled statement. Have you had a chance to look at that?
No, I haven't, sorry.
That's right. I was just interested if there was any alignment with their statement. I'll just take a pause and see if I can bring that up. Transpower. Let's have a look. No, it's taking a while to open. Here it is. Okay. They was requesting a change to how the plan works section to provide the appropriate cross references to other parts of the NPSCT and other things as well. But you haven't had a look at that. That's fine.
No.
Okay.
If you like, I could have a look at it and see whether Transpower's relief sought there would be sufficient to satisfy Manawa's needs and provide you comment back at the same time that I provide you that alternate wording.
Yes, I would appreciate that. We're always looking for commonalities or areas where similar requests are made to see if there's a way of rationalising that and potentially adding strength to what you're seeking. So yeah, by all means do that, because you are providing us with some other information anyway. So invite you to add a comment or two on their submission. That would be fine.
Okay, we'll do that.
I've got no further questions, so thank you for coming on. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Okay,
thank you.
Okay. All right, we'll take the next submitter now, which is Dairy Holdings Limited. Mr. Williams, thanks for coming along. The light comes on when you press the little button. And
evidence from, there we go. Wasn't sure what was on and what was off.
Mr. Gallagher.
Mr. Gallagher as well. So I think that's been taken as read, but I'm happy to answer questions on that. I have a large part of my career has been Rakaia, so pretty familiar with actually what's occurring on the ground there. So the main concern is set out in submissions and evidence is obviously, I guess a lot of the submission evidence is pitched around duplication, but I think it's important to also emphasise that the primary position is that the infrastructure and earthworks and activities here are not of sufficient concern to be matters that are regulated by the plan. So, and that was the primary purpose of Mr. Gallagher's evidence, to talk through outside of CPW and not relevant here, but on the South Bank, we've got Bar Hill Chertsey irrigation as well, 2 big irrigation schemes below the Gorge Bridge. Beyond that, water allocation is capped by virtue of the Water Conservation Order. It's fully allocated now. There's not going to be any drastic changes around that. Certainly what I can see in the next wee while as consents go through the renewal stage is a very small amount of consolidation as irrigation takes get more efficient and intake structures may need to be tweaked to accommodate that. But more relevantly, and sort of my concern and DHL's concern is particularly around fish screens and fish passage being a lot more understood today and going forward than what they were 10, 15, 20 years ago. So a realistic future where the existing intakes, even though they might not change in size a lot, might need to be changed in terms of how they operate to facilitate fish bypass across the front of a screen and different fish screening arrangements. So that's sort of practically why I'm here today. So as Mr. Gallagher has set out in terms of the duplication point, DHL, and it'll be the same for all the other interests on the river, already hold some pretty comprehensive consents from Environment Canterbury with regard to diversion, taking use of water in the orthodox sense, but also, and Brian set it out, some consents to Section 15 works in riverbed, facilitate diversions. Now, I certainly appreciate the officers talked about whether the Land and Water Regional Plans covers the field, so to speak, and the extent of duplication. And the officer, I think, has quite rightly said there isn't a lot of emphasis in the Land and Water Regional Plan on natural character and amenity. But I think my answers to that are really twofold. One is, particularly in the case of Rakaia, we've also got a water conservation order, which is very squarely directed at natural character and amenity. And to date, certainly my experience has been the sole remit of the regional council to implement that. So certainly in all the consenting processes I've been on the Rakaia for the last almost 20 years now, there's been a huge amount of emphasis on amenity and cultural and ecological values, which, particularly for the former two, might, or in an orthodox different context, being matters that are managed by a district council. I've certainly never seen, whether it's the Rakaia or elsewhere, a district council having a strong role in managing in river intakes, diversions of water. And the other thing and then outside the require, just to note, the Land and Water Regional Plan, as you're probably familiar with, splits into sub-regional chapters. That the sub-regional chapter that deals with Selwyn Waiora or the Ellesmere catchment, which would obviously include the Selwyn River, does include some brief but nevertheless relevant policy recognition, which is 11.4.5 of the value of the Te Waiora Lake Ellesmere catchment for its recreational amenity values. So, as I said, certainly as I see it, in a practical sense, the effects are well covered in the consenting processes I've been involved with to date, and no doubt will be going forward. The only other point I'm going to make in terms of brief summary introduction is one of the matters which I didn't mention in submissions, but it's obviously increasingly relevant, is the NES for fresh water also contains a lot of controls now around, you would have heard a lot about wetlands, but it's also got specific provisions in relation to fish passage and how they operate as well. So that, along with the Land and Water Regional Plan and the flood protection bylaw, in my view, mean that things are pretty well covered already. And just final matter, just to cover off, I've read the officers, I guess, a Q&A from the panel, and note the proposed exemption for buildings and structures, or whatever it is, with 10 metres squared around irrigation. I think that could conceivably cover the intakes themselves, but we need to get water there and water through there and water beyond there as well. So still concerned about the earthworks aspects and making sure they are not covered. And so that's all probably I wanted to say by way of summary, but yeah.
Thank you. We didn't have any questions from Mr. Geller, because my main question was what relief was being sought, and you've certainly covered that off. So thanks for that. Just a couple of questions from me, then I'll hand over. The water conservation order for the Rakaia, we would like to get a copy of that if you can arrange for that to be sent through.
I've got a hard copy here, but I'll get one sent to you.
Yeah,
so you're not relying on my ones. So
because my initial question was how well did that deal with cultural and amenity and natural character values, and you said that it does. It'll be quite good.
It very squarely does, but a lot of and with a hierarchy, effectively. Probably not quite the right word, a different regime as you move further down the river. So above Lake Coleridge, complete natural state. The Manawa as they are now, the Coleridge strip, a lot of emphasis on natural state as well, but some provisions to allow for obviously Manawa's operations, and then the gorge bridge being the relevant point where water allocation can occur, but it's still headed up further partial retention of natural waters. So I'll get a copy of that to you. So.
All right, and then 10.1 in your submissions, you've made the point that on the one hand, the order recognises that 70 cubic of irrigation can occur while still retaining outstanding characteristics and features of the river without any specification on intake and water conveyance infrastructure.
Yeah.
My question there was, and you might be able to help with this, with the water conservation order, does it attempt to be fully ring fenced and self-contained, or does it assume that other plans might have rules on on water intake structures?
It assumes that, doesn't expressly say this, but in practical speaking, this provides the framework, particularly for the regional council, to put a rules framework around that. Now, I just want to emphasise, and this has been an issue which I've addressed in hearings perhaps 15 years, the regional council position is, and I think it's the correct one, it sort of defaults to a discretionary regime for the allocation of water on the basis that, even though this is not a policy document per se, the water conservation order is quite regimented re how it sees things occurring. So there's not a specific require water allocation rule in the plan, but in terms of actual practically implementing water conservation order being one of the matters you need to consider on a consent application, this is obviously engaged every time. So.
Just so I can understand it, so if, is it possible to have a water conservation order and a set of rules and district plans like is being proposed here for natural character? Are they necessarily at odds with each other, or is it not the case that you can have both?
You can absolutely have both.
Yes. Okay. All right.
Yeah. But as I said, worked with water conservation orders elsewhere around the country. Typically they're dealing with natural state water bodies, and there's not a need for a big rules framework. The requires perhaps a bit different in that it does, the water conservation order does set an allocation regime for water. So that doesn't need to be provided for in the regional plan, but equally the regional plan has a discretionary role. You have to apply through the Land and Water Regional Plan. You can't apply for the water conservation order, but the details really in the water conservation order in this instance.
Finally, the Ashburton District Plan, what's that, you refer to that, is that an operative plan or a proposed
I
plan?
think it's the operative one I was referring to in the footnote there. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for your evidence, and also to Mr. Gallagher.
Yep.
For his, and I'm just re-clarifying just a few things, and that's mainly in terms of your evidence as well as within Mr. Kelleher's evidence that you know, the order is now fully allocated, and there will be your wording, the wording and the evidence, material change in the order of all size and scale. So there will be, is fully allocated, and there will be material change in the.
There will not be.
Sorry, in paragraph 17 of Mr. Callahan, or you could look at your own in terms of, I didn't write on yours.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yep, got you.
Yep, you got it.
Yep.
Yeah. So I'm just, even though I hear the relief that you're actually, Mr. Kelleher's, you know, asking for, but can I just have a little bit of clarification so that inside the recommended setback area, given the allocation, and thank you also for the photos. So I guess I'm talking about these.
Yep.
What works would DHL be undertaking in the future to existing infrastructure that could be captured by the pathway, the consenting pathway, additional, given that is the regional.
I guess, and this is for the sake of illustration, there's loosely three things that occur with the take of water from a large river like the Rakaia. So on occasion, particularly after a major flood event, you might have to go out into the riverbed to divert the closest spray towards your intake. So that's solely an earthworks section 15 type activity. So that's for the purposes of diverting water to the intake. Then you have the intake structure itself. Now you would have seen, if you've referred to the photos of Mr. Gallagher's evidence, you know, typically a gate of some form with, you would have seen on the Mead Investments one, for example, if you look at that one closely on the right lower image, that's a rotary fish green which goes around.
Sorry, which one?
So it's on his page 6, Mead Investment Surface Water Take.
Yes.
So on the right there, you can see a sort of round drum. It's actually a mesh drum, and the pedals in front of it through a chain make that spin around, and the reason why that moves around is to ensure that it doesn't fill up with sticks or something that they pass over it. So this was best practice fish screening perhaps 10 years ago, 15 plus years ago, fully recognised, and DHL's actually kicked off some work at the moment looking at what best practice fish screening in this modern era is. It's a really hard question because no one actually fully knows the answer, but the reality being that these intakes will need to be upgraded to, in an operational sense, they might be similar, but it'll be different mesh sizes and possibly a lot more emphasis. You can see that Mead one, the water flows straight into the intake, water coming in on an angle. So you have a approach velocity going into the screen and then a sweep velocity in terms of water flowing across the screen. So that entire intake structure there in each case, in reality, is most likely going to need to be replaced at some point. It won't be drastically different in size and scale, but it will be a different structure. And then the third activity is, once the water's through the intake, is conveying that water, sometimes in an open race, but sometimes in a pipe as well, onto the farm and irrigating with it. So those are sort of the three activities we want to cover off, as I talked about in the Q&A, with reference to the Q&A before. I think the officer's suggested amendment largely, hopefully, addresses the intake works piece, but it doesn't address the in-river works piece or necessarily the conveyance of water unless they're recognised to be pure maintenance activities. Or existing use right types activities, sorry. Yep.
Kia ora. So then outside, so that's inside. I'm just looking at outside the recommended setback area, then what works would DHL be considering to undertake in the
Outside
future?
the setback areas on farm, effectively. Or...
Just outside, not affected at all.
Yeah, okay.
Yep, cool.
So as I said, water is conveyed via an open race canal. In at least for a period of time, they need to be cleaned out on occasion. There has been a focus in recent years on piping. This is not just for DHL, it's generally piping some of those races, so installation of pipelines, irrigation on farm infrastructure. I think, crossing over sections of the plan process now, we've previously appeared on the earthworks provisions more generally, and I think the officer in that case, appreciating it was not binding on the panel, was reasonably receptive to the earthworks rules having an exemption for irrigation infrastructure maintenance.
Kia ora and thank you.
Just a very quick follow-up on the fish screens. I understand they can be quite simple things, like just literally what they are, but they can also be quite big, complex things. I saw a documentary recently on a very large structure, and there can be no doubt they serve a good purpose. But my question really is, how would a very large fish screening device or structure be assessed through the water conservation order if we were to exempt them from this plan? How would the effects on natural character be dealt with?
So I think starting proposition here is obviously these are not large ones. So we've got CPW is probably the only large intake on the North Bank below the Gorge Bridge. So they'll require taken use and divert consents and Section 15 land use consents from Environment Canterbury of stuff they hold. They were, as they occurred through the consent process, I guess almost 10 years ago now, they were put through the ring of N on amenity effects with reference to the extent to which their activity did or did not maintain the outstanding natural character of the Rakaia River. So as I said, it's not, even in the absence of express objectives and policies in the Land and Water Regional Plan that address natural character, for example, or the Regional Council still applies the requirements of the Water Conservation Order quite staunchly from my experience. So.
And just on that, is there any need, in your view, to have any cross-referencing in here? We often get this question in these sorts of chapters where other cross-references to other rules and chapters and conservation orders are useful. Do you think it's not something you asked for, obviously? You want to
No.
Yeah.
Obviously, within the plan, you've got general earthworks per se versus here, which is one relevant matter. But I think particularly given that this section, I'm just thinking out loud, this section of the plan is proposed to start with reference to, for example, the coastal policy statement and how that approaches amenity. I think it'd be quite sensible here to include something, read Water Conservation Order and what it anticipates re preservation of natural character. And as I said, that does change as you move down the river, exactly what Water Conservation Order it's seeking. But
just an observation, and without preempting anything, it might be that this panel, if we were to grant the relief you're seeking, might feel some comfort in having such a cross.
I appreciate that.
But we'll leave that for the moment. Thank you very much. All right. Sorry, Andrew, I haven't.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just looking at the evidence of Mr. Gallagher, and this sort of discussion around the regional council consents and the suggestion that they already cover natural character. So I'm just looking at those consents. So they apply within the bed of the river.
Yeah. Subject to the ongoing debate with the regional councils having read what the bed of the river actually means. So I certainly regard it as right up to the intake structure and inclusive of the intake structure out to the edge of the vegetated margin, if you like. So when it becomes farmland, you're no longer in the bed.
And the natural character rules apply from the bank of the surface water body.
Yep.
So are they in the same place or different places that these two rules apply?
I was assuming in this instance, and I'm happy to be corrected on this, that the natural character provisions here were intended to apply from the edge of the gravel.
Okay, it says bank in the rule, the bank of any surface water body. And the regional consensus from bed, which I think probably goes to the bank. So I'm just interested in the duplication that's been suggested for these regional consents and the district plan provisions. And whether you have a comment on whether there is actually duplication.
Well, I'll just provide a little bit of context around this. Certainly when these consents were obtained, and the regional council's been, I think, to the Court of Appeal on this now, the position was that the regional council and in-river works, so to speak, were the full extent of potential flood flows in a river. So that was a point, in the case of a large river like the Rakaia, a long way up the bank in any layman's talk. That has been narrowed down in recent case law to the wetted, in the case of a braided river, the bit that's generally wet most of the time, including the gravel, so to speak. So, so these consents were obtained in circumstances, and the Land and Water Regional Plan hasn't been updated, as I understand it. To any large extent, these consents do control activities from, if you like, the middle of the river or right out in the river to including the vegetated margins within the river, which would include these intake works and things like that. Here, I understand, reference to the banks of the river. Sometimes that's really easy to apply. Sometimes that's actually quite difficult to apply, and ECAN's expose of having to be challenged on that and going off to the Court of Appeals, a really good example of that. So probably an honest answer, Commissioner Willis, I'm a bit unclear, as ECAN has been as well, on exactly what is meant by bank, to the extent that the panel here is going to suggest that this plan control works beyond the bank. It'd be really good to understand what exactly that might mean. But certainly, as I said to date, my experience has been Environment Canterbury has been controlling the whole activity. Bearing in mind their role doesn't stop at whatever bank, it carries on as well in terms of the taken use of water as well. So.
Okay, so I understand the issue around definition of bank and where the wet area is, and the Environment Court advice on that. But essentially, you could argue that there could be some overlap, but also there could well be applying in different locations. So to argue that a regional consent covers the same area and covers this as the district plan is not entirely accurate.
I think there might be an argument in the context of a Section 15 activity and where exactly the line is drawn vis-a-vis what a district council may or may not do. The reality is that the regional council, there's still going to be a Section 14 activity associated with it in terms of taking use of water, and equally they are going to, that's clearly the effect arising from the activity is the conveyance of water. So the effects are still captured by the regional council, but I agree exactly where you draw the Section 15 line in a regional council context versus where a district council might pick it up is not on the present state of the case law, and this is no criticism of anyone, particularly clear. But as I said, I think the effects are still caught by virtue of Section 14 taking use of water anyway. So that's a good point.
Sure, thank you. And I'm interested in seeing the water conservation order. I did have a look at it online. This is in relation to paragraph 10. I couldn't see any statement in the water conservation order that anticipated that district council consents would be excluded. It does have a section in there, clauses 9 and 11 refer to resource consent requirements. So it has purposefully covered consenting in it, in clauses 9 and 11, and it expressly did not say we don't anticipate district councils to cover consenting, although it does make statements on other types of consents that would be excluded or not apply.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. So the water conservation order doesn't expressly exclude district council consenting activities per se. There will conceivably be, I'm trying to think if there would be any. There could conceivably be activities where you would, like a very large, like putting the present state, if you're rebuilding Coleridge Power Station, for example, you might obviously trigger district council consents in that instance, in which case the water conservation order could be a relevant matter for those. But I think it again comes back to regional councils generally managing the take use diversion of water, and what I've been talking about here is the infrastructure required to allow that to occur versus district councils managing orthodox land use activities per se. So
yeah, sure. Because I think you said the water conservation order provides the framework for regional council rules. So, and I don't disagree that there's certainly some overlap in what it covers in relation to those sort of natural environment values and amenity. But I guess whether it covers the full ambit of what is natural character and that a district plan might cover is another question. I guess finally, I've got one last question for you. So it's just in relation to your paragraph 23, and you pointed out an inconsistency around community scale irrigation being permitted, but consenting requirements in small scale farming irrigation. And I'm just wondering whether you accept that there is a difference between these two types of irrigation and the basis that one provides for, I guess, a wider benefit, public benefit, and where you might well provide an easier consenting pathway because it's in the public interest versus private business irrigation, and whether you see that there is actually a difference between those two types of irrigation, albeit that there might well be an inconsistency in approach, but do you accept that they are different?
I certainly recognise conceptually that there is some element of truth in that proposition. Just to put it into context, though, what Mr. Gallagher talks about in resemblance are 2 cubic takes, and 2 cubics is still about 4,000 hectares of irrigation. So they're not by any means insignificant. So these, those 3-4 examples he refers to are providing 10-15 families or 10-15 properties with their irrigation lifeline, so to speak. So yes, I recognise the CPW scheme is a genuine community scale, has a whole heap of benefits that arise from that, but I also don't want any suggestion or implicit suggestion that these are small and don't also carry materially significant benefits as well. In terms of overall water conservation order allocation, we've got 70 cubics. CPW controls about 30 of that, and Barkle Chertsey on the other bank about 17. So roughly, a good portion of the allocation under the water conservation order is being split up on takes like these and still delivers a lot of benefits to the wider community as well. So the reason for referring to my paragraph 23 was really putting into context that if we're concerned about natural character and amenity, it does seem in and I certainly recognise there might be reasons for doing so. It does seem odd to exempt the one that will have large scale effects and not have any regard to that. I would logically, and I'm not suggesting, logically you would thought if there was one that you were going to manage, it would be the larger one. Albeit you might do it through a controlled activity rule or some clear objectives and policy guidance around making sure it's actually going to get consent, but equally it's structured and designed in such a way that the effects are minimised to the extent possible. When we're dealing here with up to two QMEC takes, I think the effects are pretty minor in any context. So.
Well, thank you for clarifying. I guess the level of support, the level of benefit that these other schemes provide. Thank you.
Yep.
No further questions.
So just on that, for my edification, the community scale scheme, is that designated in the plan? Is that how it's permitted or provided for?
I don't want to speak for CPW, but I'm pretty sure CPW is a designated.
Because you said the plan effectively permits it. I was just curious as to how it permits. Is it through designation?
Designation.
Oh, okay. All right. Understand. Yeah, it is too. All right. No, look, thanks very much. That's been very useful. If there's anything you'd like to send to us, and I mean, you are sending us the WCO, but if you'd like to clarify any of the points that we've asked you that we've put you on the spot a little bit with about the bank of rivers and so forth, we'd welcome any further submissions from you.
I have a bit of a think on that bank of rivers point and exactly where the grey lines are drawn. And even though I haven't got a submission point on it, I will have a bit of a think about the cross-referencing point you asked as well.
Because the process from here is that the one of our panel members is not able to take part today, and we're going to obviously meet up with him and go through the evidence and work out the sorts of things we're going to ask the officers to respond to in particular. So there will be some time for you to send that in next week or two. Yeah. Right.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. With no further questions, and I think that's all of our presentations today. As I just alluded to, we will, the panel will take a short break now and go through the evidence, and we'll, down the line, we'll send a list of things that we'd particularly like the officers to address, and also anything else that's come up during the hearing. You're welcome to respond to those matters as well. So we'll adjourn the hearing at this point. Thank you very much. Thanks for everybody who took part.